In today's video, we will dive into the chilling stories of 6 notorious criminals who were sentenced to death for their heinous crimes. From Alton Coleman, whose killing spree crossed state lines, to Gary Ray Bowles, who preyed on vulnerable men along the I-95 corridor, these cases will leave you speechless. We'll explore their brutal acts, the lengthy wait for justice, and the controversial final moments before their executions. Get ready for a deep dive into some of the most unsettling true crime stories in history. Alton Coleman, State, Ohio, 53 years old. Alton Coleman's case remains one of the most complex and disturbing crime sprees in American criminal history. Born in Illinois and later targeted by multiple states, Coleman became infamous not only for the brutality of his offenses, but for the unprecedented legal outcome that followed. By the time his appeals were exhausted, he stood as one of the rare individuals in the United States to receive death sentences in 3 separate states: Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana. Ohio would ultimately carry out the execution in 2002, using lethal injection, closing the final chapter of a case that had stretched across 6 states and left families devastated. Coleman's crimes unfolded in the span of just a few weeks, between May and July of 1984. Alongside his partner and romantic companion, Deborah Brown, Coleman moved through Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio, leaving behind a trail of terror. 8 people were killed during this spree, and numerous others, children, women, elderly victims, and entire families, were assaulted, beaten, kidnapped, or sexually attacked. Survivors described extreme violence, strangulation, blunt force trauma, and prolonged assaults that left lifelong emotional and physical scars. 2 incidents stand out as defining moments in the sequence of crimes. On June 18, 1984, Coleman and Brown kidnapped 2 young girls in Gary, Indiana. One of the children survived, the other did not. Then, on July 6 in Toledo, Ohio, a woman and her daughter were murdered inside their home. These were not isolated events but part of a continuous, frantic path of violence that made Coleman one of the most hunted fugitives in the country that summer. His capture on July 20, 1984, came after a motorist recognized him from wanted bulletins. Coleman and Brown were found sitting calmly in a park. He carried a knife hidden in his sock, and a bag of clothes meant for disguises. Coleman's trials resulted in death sentences across 3 jurisdictions, a legal rarity. Brown, initially sentenced to death as well, had her sentence later reduced to life in prison. His impending execution became the center of renewed controversy. Some focused on the cruelty of his crimes, others on the ethical and procedural questions surrounding the death penalty itself. But few aspects of his final days generated more debate than his last meal. Coleman ordered one of the most extravagant last meals ever approved by the Ohio prison system: filet mignon, fried chicken, sweet potato pie, cornbread, onion rings, and cherry coke. It was described in media coverage as a banquet, lavish, indulgent, and symbolic of a tradition that many believed should not apply to someone responsible for such extensive loss of life. Families of victims openly criticized the generosity of the meal, pointing out that their loved ones died in pain and fear, not with a plate of warm food and a soft drink. Activists against the death penalty argued that the last meal ritual was about maintaining humanity in the system, not rewarding a crime. Those debates still echo through discussions about capital punishment today. Just before the execution drugs were administered, Coleman recited Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The choice of scripture added another layer of controversy. Some heard it as a final attempt at redemption, a sign of remorse or spiritual awakening in the face of death. Others felt it was performative, pointing out that none of Coleman's actions during his crime spree had reflected any religious conviction. To them, His final words sounded detached, an effort to invoke peace after years of violence. Alton Coleman's story ends at the intersection of brutality, justice, and moral debate. His crimes shocked the nation, his punishment raised legal and ethical questions, and his final moments, defined by an extravagant last meal and a biblical passage, remain sharply contested. What do these final choices say about justice and mercy? Carroll Edward, State Nevada, 47 years old. Carroll Edward, Eddie, Cole's life and crimes are a chilling testament to the capacity for evil hidden behind a seemingly ordinary existence. Born in 1939, Cole's history of violence began early, with a disturbing incident when he killed a classmate at the age of 8. This act, dismissed as an accident at the time, marked the beginning of a dark path that would span decades. His crimes were not random. They were deeply rooted in his hatred for his mother, whom he blamed for abandoning his father. His modus operandi involved targeting women who resembled his mother, a chilling manifestation of his unresolved trauma. Cole's ability to blend in and deceive made him even more dangerous, as he carried out his killings with cold precision, often using strangulation as his method of choice. Over the span of several decades, from 1948 to 1980, Cole killed at least 15 women, although he later confessed to more than 30 victims. His crimes spanned multiple states, including Texas and Nevada, where he was ultimately tried and convicted. His victims were often selected from bars and restaurants, places he frequented, and they were typically strangled in brutal, unexpected attacks. Cole's violent spree continued until his arrest in 1980, when law enforcement finally connected him to the string of murders. Upon his capture, he confessed to his crimes in full detail, which led to his conviction and eventual sentencing to death in Nevada for murders committed in 1977 and 1979. One of the most controversial aspects of Cole's execution was his last meal, a choice that sparked significant public debate. Carroll Cole requested a lavish meal, far beyond what most death row inmates would choose. His final meal consisted of giant fried shrimp, French fries, a salad with French dressing, and Boston clam chowder. This indulgent meal raised eyebrows and ignited outrage, as many saw it as a stark contrast to the suffering of his victims. While those he killed endured pain, fear, and brutality, Cole was granted a final indulgence that seemed to reward him for his heinous acts. The public outcry was swift, with many questioning the fairness of allowing a convicted serial killer to enjoy such a luxurious meal. Activists against the death penalty argued that the last meal tradition, intended to offer dignity in death, was being misused as a form of reward for those who had committed unimaginable crimes. Equally disturbing was Cole's lack of a final statement. He chose not to speak at all before his execution, which stood in sharp contrast to the remorseful or defiant final words offered by many others on death row. His silence spoke volumes, and it further reinforced his image as a remorseless, cold-hearted killer. While some might argue that his silence was a final act of defiance, refusing to show any emotion or regret, others saw it as a demonstration of his complete lack of empathy. His refusal to offer an apology to his victims or their families left many feeling that justice was not fully served. The absence of a final statement from Cole left a void that fueled public debate about his true nature. Was he simply a man who had learned to mask his emotions, or was he a psychopathic killer who had no remorse for the lives he had destroyed? The fact that he did not even attempt to express remorse added to the chilling legacy of his crimes. In his case, it seemed that the lack of a final apology or acknowledgement of guilt was the most honest reflection of the man who had coldly taken so many lives. Carroll Cole's case is a haunting reminder of the darkness that can reside within, and it raises uncomfortable questions about justice, humanity, and the death penalty. While his final meal and silence at the time of his execution might have been seen by some as an act of dignity, they also highlighted the stark contrast between the victim's suffering and the fate of the killer. Can a final meal and a lack of remorse ever truly be considered as a sign of justice, or do they reveal a deeper, more unsettling truth about the fairness of the system? Does a lavish last meal justify a killer's lack of remorse? David Allen Gore, State, Florida, 58 years old. David Allen Gore, widely known as one of the most notorious serial killers in Florida, committed a series of brutal murders between 1981 and 1983. Born in 1953, Gore, alongside his cousin Fred Waterfield, carried out a string of horrific crimes, primarily targeting young women. Gore's actions were particularly disturbing due to his connection with Waterfield, a relative who participated in several murders, but only received a life sentence, while Gore faced the death penalty. Gore's modus operandi was chillingly methodical. His victims were often chosen from bars or areas that seemed isolated, and he would abduct them, sensitive assault them, and then end their lives with strangulation. The brutality of these acts shocked both the public and law enforcement. It wasn't until 1983, after several months of investigations and mounting evidence, that Gore was arrested. DNA evidence connected him to the crimes, and during the trial, he confessed to the murders, though he claimed to have undergone a personal transformation. This assertion, however, failed to absolve him of his actions. In 1984, Gore was convicted and sentenced to death for his role in these murders. His trial was marked by a significant amount of public attention, as the case involved a family connection, and the heinousness of the crimes could not be ignored. Despite the lengthy legal process, which included multiple appeals, it wasn't until 2012, nearly 28 years after being placed on death row, that Gore was finally executed. His lengthy wait for execution sparked debates on the fairness and effectiveness of the death penalty, as the delay left many questioning the role of prolonged imprisonment in cases like his. Gore's last meal was relatively simple, though it still raised eyebrows due to its comfort food appeal. He requested fried chicken, French fries, and butter pecan ice cream, a meal that many found less extravagant than others, but still indicative of the allowances given to death row inmates in their final moments. While some criticized the tradition of providing a final meal, others defended it as a humanizing ritual. The controversy surrounding Gore's last meal, however, stemmed from the stark contrast between the lavish meal and the brutal deaths his victims endured. Many argued that allowing such a meal was a form of indulgence for someone who had shown no remorse for his actions. When it came time for his last words, Gore offered an apology that many felt was too little, too late. He expressed regret for his involvement in the death of one of his victims, saying, "I am very sorry for my involvement in the death of their daughter." He followed with the statement, "I have found peace," which some saw as a genuine acknowledgement of guilt and a sign of remorse. However, many questioned the sincerity of his words, noting the long gap between his crimes and his expressed regret. Critics pointed out that his apology came after decades of denials and manipulation, raising doubts about whether it was truly an act of contrition or a final attempt to mitigate the emotional toll of his impending death. The 28 years Gore spent on death row became a focal point for critics of the death penalty. Some believed that his extended wait for execution robbed the sentence of its meaning, leaving the public to question whether the death penalty was a deterrent or simply a prolonged process of suffering for all involved. The slow pace of the judicial process in death penalty cases was highlighted, with many arguing that justice delayed is justice denied. In Gore's case, His long wait added to the sense that the death penalty, while meant to be swift and final, often fails to deliver timely closure for victims and their families. Ultimately, the case of David Allen Gore raises fundamental questions about justice, punishment, and the effectiveness of the death penalty. While his crimes were undoubtedly brutal and deserving of a severe punishment, the lengthy period of time spent awaiting his execution, his final meal, and his apology all contribute to a larger debate about whether capital punishment can truly deliver justice. Gore's case underscores the challenges of balancing fairness, punishment, and rehabilitation in a justice system that strives to be both humane and effective. Does the death penalty truly fit the crimes committed, or does time erode its impact? David Edwin Mason, State, California, 36 years old. David Edwin Mason, a name forever linked to a series of brutal killings in California, became one of the most notorious figures in the state's history. Born in 1943, Mason was a man whose crimes spanned over a decade, marked by an unsettling pattern of violence. Between the late 1970s and early 1980s, he committed a series of murders that seemed both random and calculated. At least 5 victims were killed, including elderly individuals and fellow prisoners during his time in jail. Mason's crimes were widely regarded as being both spontaneous and ruthless, with no clear modus operandi beyond the desire to kill. His victims were often chosen from vulnerable groups, including the elderly and weak prisoners. These factors made Mason a dangerous individual, whose behavior in prison further added to the horror of his past actions. His tendency to strike without clear motive added a layer of unpredictability to the killings, and this unpredictability left investigators baffled and the public frightened. Despite the horrifying nature of his crimes, Mason went undetected for some time, until his actions were pieced together with the help of physical evidence and eyewitness testimonies, leading to his arrest. Once arrested, Mason's crimes were brought to light, and during his trial, the full extent of his brutality was revealed. In 1981, he was convicted and sentenced to death for the murders. However, his journey to execution was prolonged, taking 12 years on death row before the sentence was finally carried out. During this long period of waiting, Mason had multiple appeals, and the case sparked significant debates about the fairness and timeliness of the death penalty in the United States. For some, the lengthy wait seemed to render the punishment less of a deterrent and more of a prolonged suffering for both the convicted and the victims' families. As the time for Mason's execution approached, his last meal became a point of contention. Unlike the lavish meals often associated with some death row inmates, Mason's request was more modest: cheese sandwiches, radishes, peach pie, and chocolate chip ice cream. While not extravagant, this meal sparked debates about the tradition of last meals. Some felt that allowing a final meal, even one as simple as Mason's, was an unnecessary comfort for someone responsible for so much suffering. Critics argued that such a tradition was misplaced, particularly when compared to the lives lost and the suffering endured by the victims. In contrast, others defended the last meal as part of a ritual meant to ensure a certain level of dignity for those facing execution, regardless of their crimes. When it came time for Mason to speak, he chose silence over words. His last words were simply, "No, Warden, I want to proceed. Thank you." This lack of a final statement left many feeling unsettled. For some, it reflected Mason's inability or unwillingness to face the enormity of his actions. His refusal to express remorse or to offer an apology to the families of his victims seemed to confirm his cold, indifferent nature. Others speculated that Mason's silence could have been a final act of defiance, rejecting any last-ditch efforts to extract some form of repentance from him. The absence of remorse or a meaningful last statement created further divisions. Some argued that Mason's silence could be interpreted as an honest reflection of his character, a man who never regretted his actions, not even in the face of death. Others felt that the silence was a failure to acknowledge the horror of his crimes, and it served as a stark reminder of how little Mason cared for the lives he took. This issue highlighted the ongoing debate over the death penalty itself. Is it about justice, or is it about retribution? And does a man who has been silent in life deserve a final chance for redemption in his last moments? David Edwin Mason's case raises profound questions about the death penalty, justice, and the human capacity for remorse. After spending 12 years on death row, Mason's case became emblematic of the delays in the justice system that often lead to prolonged suffering for the convicted, the victims' families, and the public. Despite his silence and lack of remorse, his execution was ultimately carried out, but not without sparking further debates about the fairness of the death penalty and whether it truly serves as a deterrent or merely prolongs the pain. Can the death penalty ever truly fit the crime committed? Gary Ray Bowles, Stady, Florida, 57 years old. Gary Ray Bowles, infamously known as the I-95 killer, was a serial killer who terrorized the southeastern United States in the mid-1990s. Born in 1957, Bowles became notorious for murdering at least 6 men along the I-95 highway, a major stretch that runs along the east coast of the United States. His reign of terror spanned from 1994 to 1995, and his victims were primarily gay men, targeted for brutal killings that involved both rape and strangulation. Bowles's methods were often quick and violent, with his victims frequently caught by surprise. His ability to evade capture for a period of time added to the fear that gripped the public, particularly within the LGBTQ community. Bowles's modus operandi was disturbingly effective. He lured his victims into situations where they could not escape, often picking up strangers at bars or on the street. His killings were random, and the brutality he exhibited during the attacks was appalling, leaving his victims with no chance to survive. The cold, calculated nature of his crimes and the eerie similarities between each killing pointed to a deeply disturbed individual, and it wasn't long before law enforcement began connecting the dots. DNA evidence and witness testimonies eventually linked Bowles to the murders, and he was arrested in 1994. His trial in Florida resulted in a death sentence, and he was convicted for the murders of at least 6 men. Bowles spent 23 years on death row, during which time he became a subject of intense debate. Critics argued that the long wait for execution diminished the purpose of the death penalty itself. For many, Bowles's lengthy time in prison raised serious questions about the efficiency of the justice system. His case sparked conversations about whether lengthy delays in executions serve any real deterrent purpose, or if they merely prolong suffering for the victims' families. The waiting period also drew attention to the psychological toll that death row can take on those who are awaiting their final day. On the day of his execution in 2019, Bowles's last meal was simple but telling: 3 cheeseburgers, French fries, bacon, and a vanilla milkshake. While this meal was far from extravagant compared to some requests from other death row inmates, it still prompted discussions about the practice of allowing inmates to select their last meal. Some people viewed this as a necessary act of human decency in a system that offers the condemned one last bit of control, while others saw it as a troubling practice that might undermine the gravity of the crimes committed. In Bowles's case, many questioned whether he deserved any kind of comfort, given the horrific nature of his killings. Bowles's last words were more controversial than his meal. When asked if he had any final statements before his execution, Bowles simply responded, "No, Warden. I want to proceed. Thank you. His refusal to speak or offer any words of remorse left many people disturbed. For some, his silence was seen as a final act of defiance, a refusal to acknowledge the pain he had caused to his victims and their families. Others interpreted it as an expression of cold indifference, signaling that he had no remorse for his actions and was unwilling to face the consequences of his violence. The silence of Bowles in his final moments further fueled the debate about whether the death penalty is truly effective as a means of justice. The lack of any expression of regret raised questions about his humanity and whether he ever truly understood the gravity of the lives he had taken. It also brought attention to the emotional toll that the victims' families may have endured, waiting for years for justice that seemed to be delayed indefinitely. For many, Bowles's last moments reflected a man who had never fully confronted the darkness of his own actions. Gary Ray Bowles's execution, and the public's reaction to it, underscored the complicated nature of capital punishment in the United States. His long wait, his final meal, and his refusal to speak all contributed to the ongoing debate about the morality, fairness, and efficiency of the death penalty. In the end, while his execution provided closure for some, it also left many wondering if such a sentence could ever truly provide justice for the victims he left behind. Are too many benefits being given to the wrong people? Gerald Eugene Stano, State, Florida, 46 years old. Gerald Eugene Stano was a serial killer whose crimes shocked the nation for their brutality and the chilling randomness of his killings. Born in 1951, Stano's criminal activities began in 1969, but his most notorious period of killing spanned from the late 1970s into the early 1980s, primarily in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Florida. His victims were predominantly young women, many of whom were vulnerable, including those he encountered in bars or isolated areas. Stano used a variety of methods to kill, including strangulation, shooting, and stabbing. His killings were often sudden and unprovoked, making his crimes difficult to predict or prevent. Stano's modus operandi involved quickly overpowering his victims, with many of them being defenseless and easy targets in secluded locations. He would often attack women whom he encountered casually, making his killings seem random and without clear motive. The first of his confirmed murders occurred in 1969, but his more infamous killings took place in the following decades. One of the most notable cases was that of Barbara Ann McNulty, whom Stano met at a bar and subsequently abducted and murdered. His inability to resist the urge to kill led to a series of random and violent attacks, which left a trail of terror in the communities he targeted. Stano was arrested in 1980 after a survivor of one of his attacks came forward with information that led to his capture. His subsequent confession to multiple murders, paired with physical evidence and DNA, confirmed his involvement in at least 24 killings, with some estimates suggesting he may have been responsible for as many as 41 murders. His trial, which took place in Florida, resulted in a death sentence in 1981. Despite the weight of his confession, there remained doubts about whether Stano had actually committed all the murders he claimed, adding an air of uncertainty to the justice process. Stano's time on death row was extensive, spending 17 years awaiting his execution in San Quentin, California. His lengthy wait on death row raised significant debates about the effectiveness of the death penalty, with critics arguing that such delays undermined the punishment's deterrent effect. While he awaited his fate, Stano's case highlighted the flaws within the system, including the emotional toll it took on the families of the victims, who had to endure years of waiting for closure. His 17 years on death row were not just a period of legal delays, but also a time that stretched the patience of the victims' families and the public, fueling the debate over whether the death penalty still served its intended purpose. On the day of his execution in 1998, Stano's last meal request was both simple and, to some unsettling Del Monaco steak, baked potatoes with sour cream and bacon bits, salad with blue cheese dressing, beans, half a gallon of mint chocolate chip ice cream, and 2 liters of Pepsi. While not as extravagant as some last meals, the meal still sparked controversy because, in the eyes of many, Stano did not deserve such a comfort after the horrendous pain he inflicted on his victims. Critics argued that it was a misuse of taxpayer dollars and an unnecessary indulgence for someone who had taken multiple lives in cold blood. It raised questions about the fairness of the system allowing such indulgences to convicted murderers, especially when those same murderers caused untold suffering to their victims. Stano's last words were even more controversial. When asked if he had any final statement, he simply replied, "I am innocent." This declaration, made moments before his execution, was a stark contradiction to his earlier confessions, and many saw it as a final, cynical act of denial. The fact that Stano chose to assert his innocence, instead of expressing any remorse or regret, left many feeling that his silence throughout the proceedings, and his refusal to take responsibility for his actions, spoke volumes about his lack of empathy. His final words were widely perceived as a form of psychological defense, an attempt to avoid accountability even in his final moments. For many, his refusal to apologize or show remorse solidified the belief that he had no true understanding of the magnitude of his crimes. The debate surrounding Stano's actions, his lengthy wait for execution, his last meal, and his final words touched on deep questions about justice, accountability, and the role of the death penalty. His case underscored the psychological complexities of individuals like Stano, who seemed to reject any notion of repentance even after a life spent committing unspeakable acts. The emotional response to his case revealed how the system wrestles with balancing justice with human dignity, especially when dealing with individuals who, like Stano, appear utterly devoid of remorse. Could a final meal or silence ever truly balance out the lives lost? As we wrap up today's video, the stories of these 6 criminals serve as a haunting reminder of the darkness that can exist within humanity. From their shocking crimes to their controversial final moments, these cases continue to spark debates about justice, punishment, and the death penalty. While their actions have left scars on countless lives, the question remains: can justice ever truly be served, or is it merely a means of closure for the victims' families? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for more true crime stories.